Hi there and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Grace. For those of you, I'm sure there's a few of you that don't know who I am. I'm an actor, voice artist and narrator. I'm based in London in the UK. Today, on behalf of Austenesque Reviews, I have come here to read for you an excerpt from a wonderful book of short stories called Elizabeth, Obstinate, Headstrong Girl. The anthology has been carefully curated by a great author called Christina Boyd. I'm sure you're aware of her already, and includes a lot of other authors that I'm guessing you all know and love. These include Elizabeth Adams, Christina Boyd herself, Karen M. Cox, J. Marie Croft, Lee Dreyer, Janetta James, Christina Morland, Bo North, and Joanna Stans. I would like to thank Meredith Esparza for having me today and inviting me here to read for you. It's an absolute pleasure and a privilege, and I really, really hope that you enjoy this. The chapter I'm going to read is actually half a chapter. It's called Atmospheric Disturbances. It's by Christina Morland. And the other half I am going to be continuing with will be live next week on the 20th of August on the blog From Pemberley to Milton. And I hope that you can join me there too if you like this. Without further ado, because you did not come here to hear me blabber on, I'm going to get started. My good qualities are under your protection, and you are to exaggerate them as much as possible. And, in return, it belongs to me to find occasions for teasing and quarrelling with you as often as may be. Pride and Prejudice. Atmospheric Disturbances by Christina Morland. Longbourn, December 1812. When he met her gaze from across the room, she wondered that the others did not feel it. An electric charge, Mr. Franklin's kite and key, the brewing of a storm. This was not desire. She'd become well practiced at recognizing that delicious swoop of the stomach when his fingers grazed hers, or when he murmured, "Elizabeth," so that only she could hear. No, this was something else, something more dangerous. Desire was part of it, just not the entirety. There was also a tinge of amusement. To see him blush. A smattering of anger. Fie upon his abominable pride. And yes, a good dose of yearning. To kiss away that frown. Beneath all these simmering emotions, a thin, icy layer of fear. Elizabeth Bennet and Fitzwilliam Darcy were on the brink of their very first quarrel. Well, no. They had already quarrelled more times than she could remember, but those disagreements had taken place before their engagement, when she'd been trying to provoke him and he had been trying to... She supposed he had been trying to woo her, though she still found this difficult to comprehend. There were, in fact, a good many aspects of her betrothed she found difficult to comprehend, but at least she knew this. He took great pleasure in spying with her. So there was no reason to fear the approaching disagreement, yet her hands trembled with such intensity that she splattered the tea she had been tasked with pouring. "Oh, Lizzie!" cried Mrs. Bennet, snatching away the very cup Elizabeth had been trying to fill. For 2, perhaps 3 seconds, Elizabeth could do nothing but watch herself pour tea directly onto the drawing-room table. Only when Jane came to her aid, gently prying the teapot from her still trembling hands, did she manage to regain her wits. "Are you well?" her sister whispered, as they frantically sopped up the tea with the serviettes Mrs. Hill had just laundered for the fast-approaching wedding breakfast. Elizabeth could say nothing to Jane. All her attention was focused on him, how he would look at her now, his future Mrs. Darcy. How did he feel, knowing he was on the verge of marrying a woman who could not even pour a cup of tea without... What had he accused her of again? Oh yes, making a fuss. He met her gaze with what to the others must have seemed a neutral expression, but she saw how his mouth hardened, how his colour deepened. Worst of all, he raised one eyebrow, mocking her. How dare he steal her tactic of laughing at life's absurdities? At least he was the first to look away. Mrs. Bennet distracted him by rushing to his side and apologising profusely, as if Elizabeth had just poured the contents of the teapot not on the table but on his head. Now there was a thought. "She's not usually this clumsy," assured Mrs. Bennet, holding out the half-empty teacup as a peace offering. He shook his head, refusing her mother's gesture without a word, and all the amusement, embarrassment, and fear that had moderated Elizabeth's anger disappeared in an instant. "Oh, but I am clumsy," she said in a tone that caused everyone else in the room, even Mr. Bingley, who had been steadfastly pretending to read the newspaper, to look over at her. She felt their curiosity, noted their stillness, yet kept her gaze pinned on him. Then, with careful enunciation, each word a jab. "Quite clumsy." For Elizabeth, disparagement of her own person represented a radical new approach to winning arguments. She was much more likely to aim her wit at the foibles of her opponent, yet she felt, almost instinctively, that to insult herself, the woman he loved, would prove an even greater challenge to Darcy's pride than any insult she could throw at him. She was right, and wrong. His eyes flashed, his jaw twitched, his entire frame seemed to lengthen as he leaned forward onto his toes. He reminded her of a large cat preparing to pounce. Had they been alone, he might very well have pounced. Odd how her anger had obliterated all other feelings except desire. But they were not alone, and that had been her miscalculation. He may have enjoyed a good argument, but he absolutely hated having an audience. With a curt bow, he muttered, "Excuse me," and exited the drawing room. "We neither of us perform to strangers," he had said to her at Rosings in that other life when she had not understood him. Would she ever understand him? "Oh, Lizzie, you have vexed him, and just days before your wedding too," someone called after her, her mother, most likely. Elizabeth could not be certain, for she was halfway to the door when the words reached her. She thought she heard other voices as well, a worried expression from Jane, a soothing comment from Bingley, a cynical chuckle from her father, giggling from Kitty while Mary quoted Proverbs something or another. Perhaps, perhaps not. If she had learnt anything in the year since she had met Fitzwilliam Darcy, it was that she was all too quick to make assumptions about those dearest to her. Throwing open the front door, she hit a wall of wind so biting, so fierce, she nearly turned back. Then she saw him. He was turning the corner of the house, heading for the stables. "Mr. Darcy!" she shouted, breaking into a run. She abhorred her total want of pride. To race after any man, even one she loved, represented a low point for sure. Yet for all that she had dreaded their quarrel, she feared his silence more. Storms inflicted damage, but droughts choked the life out of everything. He called out, but not to her. "John, my horse!" Everything in that moment conspired against her. The bitter chill in the air, his refusal to acknowledge her, the utter lack of distress in his voice as if he were preparing for a leisurely ride across the grounds, rather than escape from his quarrelsome betrothed. Still, she would have kept her tears at bay had it not been for one minor detail. He had addressed Longbourn's groom by name. Even Mr. Bingley, kind, affable Mr. Bingley, tended to fall back on "you there" when calling for his horse. Elizabeth swiped angrily at her eyes. She did not understand Fitzwilliam Darcy, not at all. He was by turns cold and warm, kind and aloof, reticent and garrulous. And then there were all those odd details that confounded categorization. He often turned his head just before smiling, as if worried that others might see. He could not sit for more than a quarter of an hour in idle conversation, yet could spend an entirety of a rainy afternoon teaching Kitty and Mary to play chess. He bought her no gifts, wrote her no love letters, and paid her few compliments, except the compliment of attention, He also knew the name of every servant at Longbourn. Granted, there were only 5, if one did not include the woman they hired on occasion to help with the laundry. Though I suppose you know her name too, Elizabeth had teased after discovering he knew the names of all the others. Tess, he had replied, correctly. There was nothing particularly laudable in his ability to recite these names. Indeed, she was tempted to interpret this knowledge as an extension of his pride, for he himself had put it, Longbourn and all who live here are now of great importance to me. The sentiment was at once romantic and ruthless. One either existed in Darcy's orbit or was consigned to the invisibility of the ether. As he followed John into the stables, Elizabeth knew, if she was to ever maintain her own centre of gravity, that she could not allow him to take flight now. He was just mounting his horse when she came, striding in after him. Oh, why they could not have resolved their differences over a fragrant cup of tea, seated next to a crackling fire instead of out of doors where she could see her own breath and smell only horse manure. At her arrival, he paused in his preparations but did not look down at her. John, she said, her gaze fixed on her betrothed, I would speak to Mr. Darcy alone. The reins, John, said Darcy. She saw out of the corner of her eye how the servant glanced between the two of them. Had she possessed less self-restraint, had she been more like her mother or Lydia, she might have snapped at both men, reminding them that John had known her longer and therefore had no cause to consider Mr. Darcy's wishes over her own. Had she possessed more self-restraint, had she been more like Jane, she would have snapped at no one at all. As it was, she was Elizabeth, and so possessed only enough self-restraint to keep from snapping at John. Oh, come down off your high horse, Fitzwilliam Darcy, and talk to me. Such a shameful outburst. At the very least, she ought to have avoided the pun. Still, it had the desired effect. After a brief pause, he dismounted and handed over the reins with a quiet, "Thank you, John." He turned to face her. Silence, and the fear returned, a shiver across her skin. Wrapping her arms tightly about her ribcage, she willed herself to hold his gaze, and a good thing too, for she saw how, with John's departure, Darcy's entire bearing changed. Gone was the proud gentleman, shoulders thrown back, chin held high. In his place stood a man so discomposed that he tugged at his cravat as if it were too tight for him to breathe, and then threw aside his hat and gloves in order to run his fingers through his hair, a nervous habit she would never have attributed to him before their engagement. He was going to apologise. Either that or offer his coat, for he must have seen her shivering. Spinning on her heels, she called over her shoulder, "I do not want the horses to eavesdrop," and heard his reluctant laugh. They walked out into the open air where a sudden gust reminded her, as she put her hand to her head, that she had forgotten her bonnet too. When he caught up to her, tucking a strand of errant hair behind her ear, she was tempted to lean into his touch and forget everything else. Tempted, but not overcome. With a mighty yank, she pulled away from him, leaving several strands twisted about his fingers, if the stinging of her scalp was any indication. She was too angry to give in now. Be honest, Elizabeth, you are not angry. You are afraid. Yes, she, the young lady whose courage never failed to rise, was afraid. Not of him, for he was too much a gentleman to lash out. Even when she had insulted him at Hunsford, he had possessed an admirable, if annoying, degree of self-control. No, what truly frightened her was the epiphany he was bound to have, and soon. She was, and always would be, headstrong and obstinate. When he came to understand this unalterable aspect of her character, would he also come to regret his love? So yes, she was afraid, deeply afraid. Still, she was no coward. She did not shrink back or attempt to delay the inevitable, but dove in, determined that if she must reap the whirlwind, let her at least be the one to sow the wind. "You will be glad to know," she lengthened her stride to outpace him, as if that could prevent a man some 9 inches taller than her from keeping up. "That you are correct." He was at her side in an instant. "As I endeavour to be correct whenever possible, I must ask you to be more precise." Halting, she stared up at him, searching, longing for any sign of humour in his countenance, but she saw only a scowl, and so resumed her onward march, realising with each step that she had no destination in mind. "You said only minutes ago." Her teeth began to chatter as they encountered the copse of trees just beyond the house. "That I was making a fuss." "Elizabeth, for God's sake." He was tugging off his coat. "I meant only—" She quickened her pace, becoming almost too breathless to speak. "And you are right. I was making a fuss." "As you are now, too," he muttered, attempting to place the coat across her shoulders. She dodged him by darting behind a tree. "Oh, but making a fuss is what I do best, sir." "So I have come to realise," he said, taking her by the hand and trying none too delicately to shove said hand into the arm of his coat. "If you suppose from our previous encounters," she tugged free of his hold, "that my impertinence was merely a ploy to attract difficult men," then crossed her arms, "allow me to disabuse you of this notion." With what could have been a growl or a laugh, he threw his coat at her. Instinctively she caught it, each staring at the other, refusing to budge or blink. Then quietly, "Put the coat on, Elizabeth, and let us return to the house." She was halfway to doing as he said before she experienced her own epiphany. He too was headstrong and obstinate. How easy it would be to slip on his coat, knowing he would offer one of those rare smiles, the kind that made her feel as if she had just accomplished something marvellous. He would apologise for his abrupt departure, and she would forgive him without a word. Then he would say, stroking her wrist with his thumb, "I'm only doing what I think best." So she did what she thought best. She unfurled the coat like a flag and let it float to the ground. In a stroke of good luck, or perhaps it was just the wind, the coat landed at the base of a birch tree. Without stopping to think, she settled herself on his wrinkled garment, leaning back against the peeling bark and looking up with one finely arched brow. She nursed some small hope that her ridiculous behaviour might make him laugh, but he appeared a little lost and unmistakably sad. Had she gone too far, or not far enough? Would he turn on his heel and leave, or would he continue to stare down at her and frown? With a heavy sigh, he lowered himself to the ground beside her. "I am aware," she murmured into the breeze, "that my conduct today has been foolish in the extreme." He had to bite back the words, "Will you forgive me?" She was treating him poorly, behaving with shocking incivility towards this man who deserved both her love and respect. He had, after all, committed no crime, broken no promise, done nothing that would, in the eyes of respectable society, seem untoward. His only transgression had been acting like someone he was not, and this, to her, seemed the very worst of sins. This notion that she knew him well enough to recognise when he was not himself seemed nearly as absurd as her conduct. He remained an enigma she could not decipher. Still, she had once felt certain about a few core principles. He did not flaunt his wealth, and he did not suffer fools gladly. Yet in the 2 months of their courtship, he'd done both. Another woman would not have complained. Her mother certainly had not. She had squealed with delight at the bolts of fabric, the pretty little serving dishes, and the silver-slotted spoon that had appeared one by one at Longbourn. The first arriving a week after Mrs. Bennet had mentioned the need for new curtains, the second appearing on their table 3 days after her complaint about Longbourn's old chipped china, and the third showing up in a tureen of potatoes the day after Mrs. Bennet had asserted the injustice of Lady Lucas owning a finer serving implement. "You do realise," Elizabeth had told Darcy on the day of the serving spoon, that even my mother is capable of recognising a pattern, particularly when patterns result in lavish gifts. Soon she will be decrying the state of her carriage." "The gifts are hardly lavish," had been his only response. For Mary, there was sheet music she was only barely qualified to play, while Kitty received a set of novels Miss Darcy had recommended during their short stay at Longbourn. Elizabeth supposed these gifts were not unreasonable, a considerate show of brotherly affection perhaps, but then she had learnt from her father that Darcy had also offered to pay for lessons with a master for Mary and tuition to a young ladies' seminary for Kitty. She found it notable that he had given Jane only a new quill pen and her father a single book from his own collection. For Elizabeth, there had been no tangible presents at all. Had Lydia still been at Longbourn, she would surely have laughed at her sister. "He must not love you as much as he loves us, Lizzie." Elizabeth began to suspect the reverse was true. The less he liked a person, the more money he spent on his or her behalf. Indeed, by this measure, Lydia and Wickham were surely among his least favourite people in all of England. This theory, however, did not stand up to scrutiny, for she knew him to be a generous brother and landowner, and he by no means despised his sister or the people of Pemberley. Why then was he showering the Bennets with gifts when he so clearly did not enjoy their company? And that was another thing. He willingly put himself in the way of the most tiresome relatives. He visited with her mother every day and never missed a card party at Aunt Phillips's, though Elizabeth had tried several times to discourage him from attending. Had Mr. Collins resided nearby, she would not have been surprised to find Mr. Darcy dining with him every other evening. She might have thought he was attempting to demonstrate his improved manners, but when in company, he behaved with all the cold civility Meryton residents had come to expect from him. She could not make sense of his behaviour, except to fear that it signalled some deeper discontent with her. Yet when the two of them were alone, as they often were thanks to the negligence of her parents and their own great willingness to walk out in almost any weather, he was everything she could have wished for in a husband: animated, affectionate, and the very best of listeners. If they could have spent the entirety of their courtship wandering the fields and woods of Hertfordshire, laughing at stories of each other's pasts, sharing their hopes for the future, for that matter, she wished they might pass the entirety of their marriage wandering through fields and woods. Instead, they would be expected to spend at least several months of the year in London, socialising with his more exalted friends. They would visit Lady Catherine, if ever that great lady forgave them, and they would, even in the quiet of the countryside, host dinners, balls, and card parties of their own. She would, in other words, have to share him with the world, and on those occasions, he would not be her Darcy, but that cold, austere, public Darcy she had first met at the Meryton Assembly. She glanced at him now, sitting uneasily with his legs crossed and his arms, well, he did not know what to do with his arms. He crossed them, uncrossed them, then planted the palms of his hands firmly on the ground to prop himself up. He looked nothing at all like the public Darcy, but not quite like her Darcy either, for she had never thought to imagine him like this. Knees at awkward angles, fingers pressed against dead leaves and cold earth. How many different men was he, this future husband of hers? "I am also aware," she continued when he remained silent, "that another woman would thank you rather than scold you. Surely that is what you're thinking, that I ought to express more appreciation for the man who would show such generosity to my most vexing relations, that I ought to be grateful for a man who would lower himself, quite literally, to be with me." He met her gaze. "That is what you are thinking, Elizabeth, not I." Heat flooded her cheeks, and she had to blink away the sudden sting of tears. "Then what are you thinking?" With a slight lift of his chin, "My thoughts are too varied and disorderly to give voice to them at the present time." At such a statement, how could she do anything but laugh? He coloured and turned away, obviously hurt, and she immediately checked her amusement. "I laughed," she said, placing a tentative hand on his forearm, "only because that speech represented the most coherent explanation of incoherence I've ever heard." He shot her a frown that was so clearly on the verge of becoming a smile that she could not help but smile herself. When he plucked up her hand and brought it to his lips, she felt that now familiar, dearly loved swoop of the stomach, as well as a deep sense of relief. She had been wrong. This was not to be a long and tumultuous storm, but a passing shower on an otherwise sunny day. Then he dropped her hand, sighed, and looked at her in such a way that she knew they had only just passed under the eye of the storm. "What I was thinking," he said wearily, as if every word cost him something to speak aloud, "is I continue to misunderstand you, Elizabeth Bennet." His eyelids fluttered closed, and in that brief moment of absence, she was reminded of how much vitality his eyes brought to the rest of his features. Had she really once believed that the dark grey of his irises held no warmth, no feeling? It was akin to believing the tempestuous seas or the deepening twilight were empty merely because no one could easily see through them. Then his eyes snapped open, and she nearly flinched at the anger she saw there. "In acting as I have toward your family, I've only been doing what I think best, Elizabeth." Ah, there it was. That phrase she had come to expect, for he had used it several times already during their engagement. What I think best. For all his inscrutability, she at least understood this aspect of Fitzwilliam Darcy. That's where I'm going to end and pause for today. But I really do hope you can join me next week. It was an absolute pleasure to do this today, and I'm so glad that you all decided to join me and spend some time with me. I hope to see you again soon, and have lovely rest of your days, or rest of the weeks, or rest of your evenings, or whenever you're watching this. Thank you so much. Goodbye.